So we've had about a week in Janthir, and I think that overall it is a very interesting expansion in terms of concepts that ArenaNet have decided to carry forward from Soto. And I hope this first impression serves as some meaningful feedback on the changes that worked from Soto to Janthir, and some of the changes, in my opinion, that flopped. I will also finish up with some of the things that I would like to see in the unreleased elements of this expansion that will be coming out in the next few months. Let's start with the introduction to Janthir and the actual starting scenes to get into the new content. For Soto, this happened with a bang. You were thrown directly into the mix by being sucked into a portal to Nyos, being chased by a demon through hallways, only to be saved by Zoja. Janthir, on the other hand, starts off with a lot of exposition, a meeting with the Tyrian Alliance, which is a new organization that we haven't really heard of before, but it includes all races, the queens, the empresses, and all of that. Some of the dialogue is interesting, but for the most part, as a player waiting to get to the new maps, it feels like an extended loading screen. This is largely a setup for some of the political controversy that this X-Pact is kind of undermined by. It definitely feels more like a political intrigue expansion, similar to the way the Char Civil War was. But then all of this dialogue is interrupted by Isgaren, followed by some more dialogue before you get sent off to Janthir after being told that there's some rumblings going on and it's kind of inhospitable. And you arrive at the new map where you get your Warclaw immediately. You have a handful of mastery tracks to explore, and you are more or less just helping out the locals. This expansion was designed to be less high-strung, and it really does feel that way. And at the time of this recording, I'm not all the way finished with the expansion, but I am pretty close. And I mean with just the story. The story has been my primary focus as far as the first things that I've chosen to complete, and I will do a narrative and story feedback in the future once I'm done. Let's just start with what I felt this expansion has done right. For the good parts of the expansion launch, I feel that the Warclaw being handed to you is a great way to start. Also, the ability to unlock spears through a very early level mastery track is good. The reworked Warclaw feels really fun to run around on these new maps, even without the masteries. The spears are fun to mess around with, and I've only really explored the Thief, which is the class that I chose to play this expansion on. I felt that it had one of the more interesting concepts, and I did not mess with the spears during the beta at all. The maps so far are really good. They are not overly large, and they are not overly barren. They have a good mix of visual elements and little fun quests to do here and there. There is a lot of event density, which is nice. And the reintroduction of hearts with the primary focus around completing those events near the heart vendor is a nice touch. I do like this kind of method, even though I'm not exactly sure how all the heart tokens work or the tiered heart mechanic, but I will say that it is far better than just the fill in the green bar mechanic that we had with Soto. There still is some of that at certain story steps, but it is far less than it was before. There are a handful of new materials and currencies to collect, and I don't really feel like I'm missing out by skipping world boss chains or certain events to just wander around. It has a really relaxed feel, which is a nice alternative to some of the more high-paced maps that we've gotten up to this point. The homestead feature was one that didn't really engage me. It's not something I'm interested in when playing video games, but you will do some homestead stuff as part of the story very early on. I think this is a good introduction to the feature. Just because it's not for me doesn't mean that it's bad to include it in the story. I think it's great to be able to say just play the story when somebody asks about how they get their homestead or how to do homestead stuff. Now we can talk about some of the bads. The expansion has a really slow start. There are large periods of exposition that kind of pretty much bookend every single story step. And I mean, I'm a pretty slow talking monotone narrator. However, some of these bears just put me straight to sleep. They're talking about how somebody taught them this or that design, or that they want to, cultivate the land or something like that. And giving a little bit of depth to these characters is fine, but most people would prefer the show, not tell style of storytelling. And I theorize that it is cheaper and more developer friendly to do the storytelling through exposition composition than event chains, story instances, or boss encounters. Those are all typically more work than just telling a voice actor to dictate a portion of the story, and I feel like this is kind of a common sentiment in the community that they would rather have some kind of encounter or a fight or some little story instance to go through than just sitting there waiting for dialogue to end. The tail end of Soto had a lot of this, and it really wasn't popular there either, so it's a shame to see this kind of storytelling carried over to start this expansion and to kind of permeate through this expansion. As for the mob designs, the animations, and general fights, they are very dangerous and challenging, primarily because there's a large amount of boon strips and boon corruptions, which happens pretty rarely in the open world up to this point. There's not too many mobs that corrupt your boons, and I feel that it is worse than the frogs in Soto that would just steal your boons. This combined with a lot of melee hate and melee denial and a lot of the encounters makes most classic open world builds feel really bad. Any amount of stability turns into fear, any amount of quickness turns into slow, and fury turns into weakness, along with protection being up on a lot of these veteran mobs. I'm running around with kind of a modified quickness Deadeye, and I found myself in pretty dire straits just from fighting veteran mobs in certain packs through some of the non-group event encounters, just because I end up debuffing myself super hard when I get jumped on. Some builds I'm sure will be fine, and I found myself having to explore some build craft just to kind of find one that fits well. It's not the worst thing in the world, but I'm sure that most people find this very annoying when they're just trying to run around and complete events. Another thing that I kind of dislike about the release cadence is, just like with Soto, outside of the relic hunt, which is a nice little task for us endgame players to complete, there isn't any real meaningful endgame items to acquire at this point. There is the ability to pre-grind some things, like I'm sure the new currencies are going to be involved in the new legendaries, but you don't really know how much of a given item will be needed for the legendary spear or the legendary backpack, and it would be nice to see some amount of communication in the near future to give people like me a goal to work towards in the initial launch before the instance content drops. So it'd be nice to know, do I need all the armor sets? Do I need, X number of Titan, or do I need X number of flowers? It would be good to know these things. Outside of talking about the story, I do believe that Janthir Wilds was a good addition to the Guild Wars 2 franchise. There are definitely some areas to improve in this content release cadence. Maybe I'll release a video on my ideal cadence or how I would structure things if I were the king of ArenaNet. But for now, I'm enjoying the expansion. I definitely think it's worth picking up. Once I'm done with the story, I'll talk about the narrative structure of Janthir as it relates to its predecessor. But for right now, I think that it is good enough, especially with the addition of the 4th map. So we'll see what comes in the future with Janthir, and that is my first impression. I would say it's probably a 7 out of 10, maybe a 6 out of 10, depending on which actual aspect we're talking about. But it's fun. It's definitely worth the $25, and I will likely be picking this up on my secondary account in the future. With that, I want to thank you for watching. A special thanks to all of my subscribers, and if you're new here, please consider subscribing. Thanks again, and I will catch you on the next one. Peace.